87-year-old farmer drives tractor to court. Judge Caprio's kind, ruling leaves room, speechless. The morning air in Providence, Rhode Island carried the crisp freshness of early autumn, painting the city in hues of gold and amber as the sun crested over the historic buildings that lined the courthouse square. It was a typical Tuesday morning at the Providence Municipal Court, where Judge Frank Caprio had presided for over 3 decades with his characteristic blend of legal wisdom and genuine compassion for the human condition. The familiar rhythm of the courthouse was beginning its daily dance. Attorneys shuffling through case files, clerks organizing dockets, and citizens arriving for various hearings that would determine small but significant pieces of their lives. The building itself, with its imposing granite facade and towering columns, had witnessed countless human dramas unfold within its walls, but today would bring something entirely unexpected. Judge Caprio sat in his chambers, reviewing the morning's cases with the same meticulous attention he had brought to every day of his judicial career. At 84 years old, his passion for justice had never dimmed, nor had his remarkable ability to see beyond the legal facts to the human stories that brought people into his courtroom. His desk was adorned with family photographs, letters from grateful citizens, and small mementos that represented decades of connecting law with humanity. The morning docket appeared routine, a collection of traffic violations, minor disputes, and regulatory infractions that comprised the daily business of municipal court. But one case caught his attention. Harold Thompson, age 87, cited for operating a farm vehicle on public roads without proper registration. The violation had occurred on Route 6, a major thoroughfare that connected Providence to the rural areas surrounding the city. Frank paused, his pen hovering over the case file. An 87-year-old farmer with an unregistered vehicle violation. This was the kind of case that often revealed deeper stories about changing communities, economic pressures, and the quiet struggles of people living on the margins of a rapidly modernizing world. In his experience, when elderly farmers appeared in traffic court, the circumstances were rarely straightforward. As the morning progressed toward Harold's scheduled hearing time, an unusual sound began to penetrate the courthouse's thick walls. It was a low, rhythmic rumbling that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Court officers exchanged curious glances. Attorneys looked up from their papers, and citizens waiting in the hallways began to murmur among themselves about the strange mechanical sound that was clearly approaching the building. The sound was unmistakably that of a diesel engine, but not the smooth hum of a modern vehicle. This was the deep, steady chug of heavy machinery, the kind of sound that spoke of decades of honest work, of equipment built to last, of a way of life that measured time not in minutes, but in seasons. Judge Caprio, hearing the commotion from his chambers, walked to his window that overlooked the courthouse parking area. What he saw made him pause in wonder and admiration. Rolling slowly up the tree-lined street toward the courthouse was a sight that belonged more to the rural countryside than to the heart of Providence. An elderly farmer driving a weathered but well-maintained tractor, its large wheels turning steadily as it navigated the city streets with careful precision. The tractor was clearly vintage, probably from the 1960s or early 1970s. Painted in faded green with patches of rust that spoke of decades spent in fields and barns. Its operator sat high in the metal seat, his posture erect despite his advanced age, his hands steady on the wheel as he guided his agricultural chariot through the urban landscape with the same care he had likely shown tending his crops for more than half a century. People on the sidewalk stopped to stare, not with mockery or irritation, but with a mixture of curiosity and respect. There was something dignified about the sight. An elderly man, who had clearly chosen the most practical means of transportation available to him, regardless of how unusual it might appear in this setting. The tractor moved at its own, unhurried. pace, neither rushing nor delaying, embodying the patient rhythm of agricultural life that has sustained communities for generations. Frank watched as Harold Thompson, for he was certain this had to be the farmer scheduled for the 10:30 hearing, carefully maneuvered his tractor into the courthouse parking area. The machine looked enormous among the sedans and SUVs that typically filled these spaces, but Harold handled it with the expertise of someone who had been operating such equipment for most of his adult life. The judge observed as Harold shut off the engine, the sudden silence almost startling after the steady rumble that had announced his arrival. The elderly farmer climbed down from the high seat with careful movements that spoke of age and probably some arthritis, but also of a lifetime of physical work that had kept him strong and capable well into his 9th decade. Harold was dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, a clean button-down shirt, pressed trousers, and worn but polished boots. His grey hair was neatly combed, and despite the unconventional nature of his transportation, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that immediately commanded respect. This was a man who understood the importance of showing proper respect for the court, even if his circumstances required him to arrive in an unusual manner. As Harold gathered what appeared to be a folder of documents from a metal box mounted on the tractor, Judge Caprio felt a familiar stirring in his heart. This was why he had devoted his life to the law, not for the power or prestige, but for moments like this, when the formal world of legal proceedings intersected with the real lives of real people, each carrying their own story of struggle, perseverance, and dignity. The courthouse staff and early arrivals watched with growing curiosity as Harold made his way toward the entrance. His movements were deliberate but unhurried, reflecting the patient pace of someone who had spent his life working with the natural rhythms of growth and harvest. He nodded politely to the people he passed, his weathered face showing traces of a lifetime spent outdoors. But his eyes were clear and alert, reflecting an intelligence and awareness that had nothing to do with formal education and everything to do with practical wisdom. Frank returned to his desk, but his mind was already engaged with the story that was about to unfold. Harold Thompson's case was no longer just another traffic violation on the docket. It was a window into the experiences of rural Americans, particularly elderly farmers, who were navigating an increasingly complex world with the same values and practical approaches that had served them throughout their lives. The judge understood that Harold's arrival by tractor was not a publicity stunt or an act of defiance. It was simply the most logical solution to a transportation problem faced by an elderly man who needed to appear in court. The fact that it had created such a stir revealed more about the urban-rural divide and society's expectations than it did about Harold's judgment or character. As the courtroom began to fill with its usual morning crowd, word of the farmer's arrival spread quickly. People craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the man who had driven his tractor to court, but the mood was not one of amusement or ridicule. Instead, there was a growing sense of respect and curiosity about this individual who embodied values of independence, resourcefulness, and dignity that many people admired but rarely encountered in their daily lives. Court officers, who had seen countless unusual situations over their careers, found themselves impressed by Harold's quiet confidence and respectful demeanor. Here was someone who clearly understood that appearing in court was a serious matter, who had taken care to dress appropriately and arrive on time, and who had solved his transportation challenges in the most practical way available to him. Judge Caprio took his place on the bench, but his attention was already focused on the case that would soon be called. He could see Harold in the back of the courtroom, sitting quietly with his folder of papers, waiting patiently for his turn to address the court. The elderly farmer's presence seemed to bring a different energy to the room, a sense of authenticity and groundedness that contrasted with the often frantic pace of modern legal proceedings. As the morning session began, Frank found himself thinking about the broader implications of Harold's case. Rural America was changing rapidly, and elderly farmers like Harold often found themselves caught between traditional ways of life and increasingly complex regulatory requirements. The simple act of operating a tractor on public roads, something that had been routine for decades, was now subject to registration requirements, insurance regulations, and safety standards that reflected urban concerns more than rural realities. But more than the legal complexity, Frank was struck by Harold's embodiment of values that seemed increasingly rare in modern society: self-reliance, dignity in the face of challenges, and the kind of practical problem-solving that had built American communities for generations. The elderly farmer's decision to drive his tractor to court was not just about transportation. It was a statement about who he was and how he chose to navigate the world. As the time for Harold's case approached, Judge Caprio prepared himself for what he sensed would be a significant moment, not just in terms of legal precedent, but in terms of recognizing and honoring the quiet dignity of everyday people who continued to embody the best values of American character, even when those values seemed increasingly out of step with contemporary expectations. When Harold Thompson's case was called, the courtroom fell into an unusual hush. The elderly farmer rose slowly from his seat in the back of the gallery, his movements careful but determined. As he made his way toward the defendant's table, carrying his worn folder with the same deliberate precision he had shown in operating his tractor, every person in the courtroom seemed to sense they were about to witness something extraordinary. Judge Frank Caprio watched Harold's approach with growing admiration. Despite his advanced age and the unconventional circumstances of his arrival, the farmer carried himself with a quiet confidence that spoke of a lifetime of honest work and clear conscience. His weathered hands, marked by decades of labor, gripped the folder firmly but without anxiety. His weathered face, lined by years of sun and wind, showed no sign of embarrassment or apology for his unusual mode of transportation. As Harold took his place at the defendant's table, Frank noticed the respectful attention the farmer commanded from everyone present. Court officers, attorneys, and citizens waiting for their own cases all seemed to recognize that they were in the presence of someone who represented values and experiences that were becoming increasingly rare in their rapidly changing world. The court clerk read the charges in her clear, professional voice. Harold Thompson, age 87, cited for operating an unregistered farm vehicle on Route 6, a violation of state motor vehicle regulations. The words sounded stark and impersonal when read aloud, but Frank knew that behind every citation lay human circumstances that were often far more complex than the legal language could capture. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the warmth and respect that had made him beloved throughout Rhode Island's legal community. His tone immediately established that this would not be a typical traffic court proceeding, but rather a conversation between two men who understood that life's realities were often more nuanced than legal statutes might suggest. Harold straightened his shoulders and began to share his story with the same straightforward honesty that had guided his interactions with neighbors, customers, and community members for nearly 9 decades. His voice, though aged, carried clearly through the courtroom, commanding attention not through volume, but through the unmistakable ring of authenticity. The farmer explained that he had been operating his small family farm for over 60 years, working the same 40 acres that his father had purchased in the 1940s. The land, located about 15 miles outside Providence, had sustained his family through decades of economic changes, technological advances, and social transformations that had altered the landscape of American agriculture beyond recognition. Harold's farm was not one of the large commercial operations that dominated modern agriculture, but rather a small-scale enterprise that supplied fresh produce to local markets, restaurants, and long-time customers who valued the quality and flavor that came from traditional farming methods. His crops, tomatoes, corn, various vegetables, and a small orchard were grown using techniques passed down through generations, modified by experience and wisdom rather than driven by the latest agricultural trends. The citation, Harold, explained, had occurred while he was transporting a broken piece of equipment from his farm to a repair shop in town. His old pickup truck, which he typically used for such trips, had broken down the previous week, leaving him without conventional transportation. The repair costs for both the truck and the farm equipment would strain his limited budget. So he had made the practical decision to use his tractor to move the equipment himself. Frank listened intently as Harold described the economic realities facing small farmers like himself. The costs of maintaining multiple vehicles, securing proper registrations and insurance for equipment used only occasionally on public roads, and complying with increasingly complex regulations were becoming overwhelming for elderly farmers operating on tight margins. Harold's decision to use his tractor was not an act of defiance or ignorance of the law, but rather a practical solution to a financial challenge faced by many rural Americans. The farmer opened his worn folder and produced a collection of documents that told the story of his lifelong commitment to his community and his responsible approach to both farming and citizenship. There were decades of tax records showing his consistent contributions to local revenue, letters from customers praising his products and integrity, and documentation of his volunteer work with local food banks and community organizations. Harold explained that he had always been careful to operate his tractor safely when using public roads, traveling only during daylight hours, staying as far right as possible, and using proper lighting and reflective markers to ensure visibility. His violation was purely administrative, a matter of not having the specific registration required for farm vehicles operating on public highways, rather than any unsafe or reckless behavior. Judge Caprio found himself deeply moved by Harold's story, which seemed to encapsulate the challenges facing rural America in an increasingly urbanized and regulated society. Here was a man who had spent his entire adult life contributing to his community, feeding his neighbors, and embodying the values of hard work, independence, and responsibility that had built American communities for generations. The farmer's situation highlighted the often unintended consequences of well-meaning regulations that were designed primarily with urban conditions in mind. While vehicle registration requirements made perfect sense for regular road users, they created significant financial and bureaucratic burdens for elderly farmers who might need to use public roads only occasionally and who were already struggling. To maintain viable, small-scale operations in an economic environment increasingly dominated by large agricultural corporations. Harold's voice took on a note of quiet concern as he explained his broader situation to the court. At 87, he was one of the last farmers in his area, watching as neighbors sold their land to developers or large agricultural companies. The young people in his family had pursued careers in the city, leaving him to work the farm largely alone. While he remained physically capable and mentally sharp, he was increasingly aware that his way of life represented a vanishing piece of American heritage. The economic pressures facing Harold extended beyond just transportation costs. Rising property taxes, increasing costs of seeds and supplies, unpredictable weather patterns, and competition from large-scale operations all threatened the viability of small farms like his. Yet Harold continued farming, not just for economic reasons, but because he believed in the value of producing healthy food for his community and maintaining a connection to the land that had sustained his family for generations. Frank could see that Harold's case represented far more than a simple traffic violation. It was a window into the experiences of elderly Americans who had built their lives around values of self-reliance, community service, and practical problem-solving, but who now found themselves navigating an increasingly complex regulatory environment that often seemed designed for different circumstances than their own. The judge was also struck by Harold's dignity in the face of his challenges. Despite his financial constraints and the unusual circumstances that had brought him to court, the farmer showed no self-pity or resentment. Instead, he presented his situation with the same straightforward honesty he had probably brought to every aspect of his life, acknowledging the facts, accepting responsibility for his actions, and trusting that reasonable people could find fair solutions to complex problems. As Harold concluded his explanation, he expressed genuine regret for any inconvenience his unregistered tractor might have caused other drivers, while also noting that he had received no complaints about his careful and courteous operation of the vehicle. His concern was not primarily for himself, but for ensuring that he could continue to serve his customers and maintain his farm operations within the bounds of the law. The farmer's story resonated throughout the courtroom, touching everyone present with its authenticity and quiet dignity. Here was a man who had lived through nearly a century of American history, who had contributed to his community in countless ways, and who continued to embody values that many people admired but rarely encountered in their daily lives. Judge Caprio found himself facing a case that perfectly illustrated the tension between necessary regulations and individual circumstances, between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice that should guide its application. Harold Thompson was clearly not the kind of person these vehicle registration laws were designed to address. Yet technically, he had violated the regulations and appeared before the court seeking resolution. As the farmer concluded his testimony and returned the documents to his folder with the same careful precision he had shown throughout the hearing, Frank prepared to respond to a case that had touched him more deeply than most. This was a moment that would require all of his experience, wisdom, and humanity to address not just the legal facts, but the human dignity of a man who represented the best of American character and values. Judge Frank Caprio sat in thoughtful silence for several long moments after Harold Thompson finished speaking, the weight of the farmer's story settling over the courtroom like morning mist over fertile fields. The judge's decades of experience had taught him to recognize when a case transcended its legal parameters to become something larger, a moment where the administration of justice could either honor or diminish the human dignity of those who appeared before the court. Frank's eyes never left Harold's face as he processed not just the legal facts of the case, but the profound human story that had brought this 87-year-old farmer to his courtroom. In Harold, the judge embodied the values that had built American communities: self-reliance, dignity in labor, commitment to community, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of working closely with the natural world and understanding its rhythms and demands. The courtroom remained unusually quiet, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing a moment of genuine judicial contemplation. This was not the routine processing of a traffic violation, but rather a careful consideration of how law and human circumstances intersected, how justice could be served in a way that honored both legal requirements and individual dignity. Judge Caprio's expression reflected the internal dialogue between his legal training and his deeply held beliefs about the role of compassion in the administration of justice. He had always believed that great judges were distinguished not just by their knowledge of legal precedent, but by their ability to apply the law in ways that served its deeper purposes, maintaining order while protecting the vulnerable, enforcing standards while recognizing individual circumstances, and upholding the system while never losing sight of the human beings whose lives were affected by judicial decisions. As Frank prepared to respond, his mind drew upon decades of similar cases, where elderly citizens had found themselves caught between traditional ways of life and increasingly complex regulatory requirements. He had seen farmers, fishermen, craftspeople, and other individuals whose livelihoods depended on practices that had sustained communities for generations, but who now faced bureaucratic obstacles that seemed disconnected from the realities of their daily lives. The judge's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a warmth and respect that immediately conveyed to Harold and everyone present that this would not be a routine judicial response. Frank had developed over the years a remarkable ability to speak not just to the individual before him, but to the larger human values that each case represented, making his courtroom a place where legal proceedings became opportunities for community, healing, and understanding. Frank began by acknowledging Harold's dignity and the respect he commanded not just for his age, but for the way he had lived his life and continued to contribute to his community. The judge spoke of the importance of agriculture to American society, of the courage required to maintain a small farm in an era of corporate agriculture, and of the wisdom that came from a lifetime of honest labor and community service. The judge's words carried particular weight because they came from someone who clearly understood and appreciated the values that Harold represented. Frank spoke of his own family's immigrant heritage, of the struggles his grandparents had faced in building new lives in America, and of the respect he had always felt for people who worked the land and fed their communities through the labor of their own hands. As Frank continued, his response began to address the broader implications of Harold's case. The judge spoke eloquently about the tension between necessary regulations and individual circumstances, about the challenge of applying urban-centered laws to rural realities, and about the importance of ensuring that legal systems served all citizens fairly, regardless of their economic circumstances or way of life. Frank's judicial philosophy had always emphasized that laws were meant to serve people, not the other way around. While regulations had important purposes, ensuring safety, fairness, and order, their application should always be guided by wisdom, compassion, and an understanding of the human circumstances they were meant to address. In Harold's case, the judge could see clearly that the spirit of the vehicle registration laws was to ensure safe operation of equipment on public roads, a standard that Harold had clearly met through his careful and responsible behavior. The judge's voice grew, more passionate as he addressed what he saw as the larger significance of Harold's situation. Frank spoke of the value of preserving family farms, of supporting elderly citizens who continued to contribute to their communities, and of ensuring that regulatory systems enhanced rather than hindered the kind of productive, responsible citizenship that Harold exemplified. Judge Caprio's response also addressed the economic realities facing Harold and similar farmers. Frank acknowledged the financial pressures that made compliance with multiple regulatory requirements particularly burdensome for small-scale operators, and he expressed concern about creating systems that effectively excluded people of modest means from full participation in economic life. The judge's words began to build toward a decision that everyone in the courtroom sensed would be significant. Frank had always been known for his ability to find creative solutions that honored both legal requirements and human dignity, but this case seemed to call for something particularly thoughtful and compassionate. As Frank's response continued, he began to address Harold directly, speaking to him not as a defendant who had violated regulations, but as a citizen whose contributions to the community deserved recognition and respect. The judge's tone conveyed deep appreciation for Harold's lifetime of service, his continued commitment to his community, and his dignity in facing the challenges of aging while maintaining his independence and productivity. Frank spoke of the lessons that Harold's generation could teach younger Americans about the values of hard work, community service, and practical problem-solving. He noted that Harold's decision to drive his tractor to court, while unusual, demonstrated exactly the kind of resourcefulness and determination that had built American communities and continued to make them strong. The judge's voice took on an almost reverential quality as he described Harold's embodiment of American values that transcended political divisions or economic circumstances. Here was a man who had lived through nearly a century of changes, who had adapted to new circumstances while maintaining his core values, and who continued to contribute to his community even as he faced the inevitable challenges of advanced age. Frank's response was building toward what everyone in the courtroom could sense would be a moment of profound judicial compassion. The judge had clearly been moved not just by the specific circumstances of Harold's case, but by what the elderly farmer represented about the best aspects of American character and community life. As Judge Caprio prepared to announce his decision, the courtroom fell into an expectant hush. Everyone present understood they were about to witness something significant, not just the resolution of a traffic case, but a demonstration of how justice could be administered in a way that honored both law and human dignity, that recognized individual circumstances while maintaining community standards, and that celebrated the values that made communities strong and resilient. The judge's expression reflected both the seriousness of his judicial responsibility and the deep warmth he felt toward Harold as a person who embodied virtues that Frank had spent his career trying to protect and honor through the fair application of law. This was the kind of moment that had drawn Frank to the judiciary, an opportunity to use legal authority not just to punish violations, but to recognize and celebrate the human dignity of those who appeared before the court. The moment had arrived for Judge Frank Caprio to render his decision, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The judge rose from his seat, something he rarely did during routine proceedings, and walked around to the front of his bench, positioning himself closer to Harold and eliminating the formal distance that typically separated judge from defendant. This simple gesture immediately signaled that what was about to happen would transcend the usual boundaries of legal proceedings. Frank's eyes met Harold's directly, and in that moment, the 87-year-old farmer saw something that had been missing from many of his recent interactions with official systems: genuine respect and understanding. The judge's expression conveyed not just legal authority, but human warmth and appreciation for the story he had just heard and the man who had shared it. Judge Caprio's voice, when he began to speak, carried the weight of decades of judicial experience combined with a deep well of compassion that had made him beloved throughout Rhode Island and beyond. His words were measured and deliberate, crafted not just to address the legal facts of Harold's case, but to honor the dignity and contributions of a man who represented the best of American character. Frank began by addressing the technical violation that had brought Harold to court. With characteristic clarity, he acknowledged that the farmer had indeed operated an unregistered vehicle on public roads, and that such regulations existed for important reasons related to safety, insurance, and administrative oversight. But then, the judge's voice took on a different quality as he explained why Harold's case demanded a response that went beyond mere technical compliance. The judge spoke eloquently about Harold's lifetime of responsible citizenship, his careful and safe operation of his tractor, and his clear intent to comply with the spirit of the law, even if he had fallen short of its technical requirements. Frank noted that Harold's violation was purely administrative, a matter of paperwork and fees, rather than any unsafe or irresponsible behavior that had endangered others or disrupted community order. But Judge Caprio's response went far beyond the specific facts of the case. Frank began to speak about Harold as a representative of values that deserved not just legal consideration, but community recognition and support. The judge's voice grew stronger and more passionate as he described the importance of family farms. To American society, the courage required to maintain traditional agricultural practices in a changing economy, and the wisdom that came from a lifetime of productive labor and community service. Frank's decision began to take shape as he explained his philosophy of justice, a philosophy that required judges to consider not just the letter of the law, but its spirit and purpose. In Harold's case, the judge could see clearly that the vehicle registration requirements were designed to ensure responsible operation of equipment on public roads, a standard that Harold had clearly met through his decades of careful and conscientious behavior. The courtroom listened in rapt attention as Judge Caprio announced that he was dismissing all charges against Harold Thompson. But the judge's reasoning went far beyond simple legal mercy. Frank explained that Harold's case represented an opportunity to recognize and celebrate the kind of citizenship that made communities strong and resilient. The judge's voice broke, slightly with emotion as he continued, explaining that Harold's decision to drive his tractor to court was not a sign of disrespect for the legal system, but rather a demonstration of exactly the kind of practical problem-solving and determination that had built American communities. Frank noted that Harold had found a way to meet his legal obligations despite financial and transportation challenges, showing a commitment to civic responsibility that deserved recognition rather than punishment. But Judge Caprio was not finished. In the move that stunned everyone present, Frank announced that the court would take additional steps to honor Harold's contributions to the community. The judge explained that he was directing court staff to work with Harold to ensure that his farm equipment met all necessary registration requirements, with the court covering any associated fees as a recognition of the farmer's lifetime of community service. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, but Frank raised his hand to continue. The judge's voice took on an even more emotional quality as he explained that Harold's story would be shared with the broader community as an example of the values that deserved celebration and support. Frank spoke of his intention to work with local organizations to ensure that elderly farmers like Harold received the assistance they needed to navigate increasingly complex regulatory requirements. Judge Caprio's response had transformed Harold's case from a routine traffic violation into a moment of community recognition and support. The judge explained that Harold's dignity, his lifetime of contribution, and his continued commitment to serving his community deserved not just legal mercy, but active assistance in overcoming the challenges he faced. Harold, who had maintained his composure throughout the proceeding, finally showed visible emotion as the full impact of the judge's decision became clear. Tears filled the elderly farmer's eyes as he realized that he was not being punished for his circumstances, but celebrated for his character and contributions. The man who had expected to pay a fine and face potential restrictions on his farming operation instead found himself recognized as an exemplar of American values. But the impact of Judge Caprio's decision extended far beyond Harold's individual case. Everyone in the courtroom understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of how justice could be administered with both legal wisdom and human compassion, how individual cases could become opportunities for community healing and recognition, and how those in authority could use their positions to celebrate and support the best aspects of human character. Frank's voice grew even more passionate as he addressed the broader implications of Harold's story. The judge spoke of the importance of supporting family farms, of recognizing the contributions of elderly citizens, and of ensuring that legal systems served all members of the community fairly and compassionately. Harold's case had become a platform for advocating for the values and people who often went unrecognized in modern society. The judge's decision also included practical elements designed to address the broader challenges facing Harold and similar farmers. Frank announced that he would be working with local agricultural organizations, legal aid societies, and government agencies to develop programs that would help elderly farmers navigate regulatory requirements more easily and affordably. As Judge Caprio concluded his response, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. Everyone present understood they had witnessed something that transcended routine legal proceedings, a moment where law and humanity had combined to create something beautiful and meaningful. Harold's simple dignity had inspired a judicial response that honored not just his individual circumstances, but the values he represented and the community he had served for so many decades. Harold slowly rose from his seat, his movements careful, but filled with new energy and hope. The elderly farmer approached Judge Caprio, and the two men shook hands with mutual respect and warmth that seemed to bridge generational and social divides. In that handshake was recognition of shared values, mutual respect, and the kind of human connection that made communities strong and resilient. As Harold prepared to leave the courtroom, the spontaneous applause resumed and continued until the elderly farmer had made his way out of the building. But the impact of what had occurred would extend far beyond that moment, as word of Judge Caprio's compassionate response spread throughout the community and eventually around the world. The story of the 87-year-old farmer who drove his tractor to court and received not punishment but recognition would become a powerful reminder that justice, at its best, could celebrate human dignity and community values rather than simply enforce technical compliance with regulations. Harold Thompson had come to court expecting to face consequences for his circumstances, but instead had found himself honored for his character and contributions. Judge Frank Caprio had demonstrated once again why he was beloved, not just as a legal authority, but as a moral voice in his community. His response to Harold's case showed how those in positions of power could use their authority to uplift and celebrate the best aspects of human nature, creating moments of connection and understanding that strengthened the fabric of society itself. The weeks following Harold Thompson's court appearance brought changes that neither the elderly farmer nor Judge Frank Caprio could have anticipated when that morning began with the unusual sound of a tractor approaching the Providence courthouse. What had started as a simple traffic violation had blossomed into something far more significant, a story that touched hearts across America and sparked conversations about values, community, and the true meaning of justice. News of Harold's case spread first through local Rhode Island media, where the image of an 87-year-old farmer driving his tractor to court captured the imagination of reporters and viewers alike. But the story's appeal transcended regional boundaries. As people across the country recognized Harold's dignity and Judge Caprio's compassionate response, something that spoke to universal values about respect, hard work, and community support. Social media platforms became filled with images of Harold's weathered tractor parked among the courthouse's modern vehicles, accompanied by thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of elderly farmers, family agricultural traditions, and encounters with public officials who had shown unexpected kindness and understanding. The visual contrast between Harold's practical farm equipment and the formal courthouse setting became a powerful symbol of the intersection between traditional values and modern institutions. Television networks picked up the story, drawn not just by its heartwarming nature, but by its representation of larger themes about rural America, economic challenges facing small farmers, and the importance of treating all citizens with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Interview requests poured in from national programs, but Harold, with characteristic humility, preferred to let his actions speak for themselves rather than seek attention or celebrity. Judge Caprio found himself once again at the center of national attention for his compassionate approach to justice, but his focus remained on the practical impact of Harold's case on similar situations facing elderly and economically challenged citizens. The judge used the attention to advocate for programs that would help small farmers navigate regulatory requirements, support elderly citizens in maintaining their independence, and ensure that legal systems served all community members fairly. The most significant immediate impact was felt in Harold's own community, where his story inspired neighbors and local organizations to provide practical support for his farming operation. Volunteers offered help with equipment maintenance, local mechanics provided services at reduced rates, and customers increased their support for his produce, recognizing the value of preserving family farms in their area. Agricultural organizations throughout Rhode Island and neighboring states began using Harold's story as an example of the challenges facing elderly farmers and the importance of community support for traditional agricultural practices. His case became a catalyst for policy discussions about how regulatory systems could be made more accessible and affordable for small-scale operators while still maintaining necessary safety and administrative standards. Educational institutions also embraced Harold's story as a teaching tool about American values, community responsibility, and the importance of treating all citizens with dignity. Schools throughout the region invited Harold to speak about farming traditions, and his visits became opportunities for young people to learn about agriculture, hard work, and the satisfaction that comes from contributing to one's community. The legal community took particular notice of Judge Caprio's handling of Harold's case as an example of how judicial discretion could be exercised to serve both legal requirements and community values. Law schools began using the case in courses about judicial philosophy, community justice, and the role of compassion in legal decision-making. Perhaps most importantly, Harold's story inspired other elderly citizens facing similar challenges to seek help rather than struggling alone with complex bureaucratic requirements. Legal aid organizations reported increased requests for assistance from elderly farmers, small business owners, and other individuals who had been inspired by Harold's example to address their regulatory challenges proactively rather than hoping to avoid detection. The practical programs that Judge Caprio had promised in his courtroom response began to take shape through partnerships with legal aid societies, agricultural extension services, and volunteer organizations. These initiatives provided elderly farmers with assistance in understanding and complying with registration requirements, insurance obligations, and safety standards, helping them maintain their operations within legal boundaries. Harold himself became an inadvertent symbol of successful aging, demonstrating that advanced age need not mean withdrawal from productive activity or community contribution. His continued farming operations, supported by increased community awareness and practical assistance, showed that elderly citizens could remain active and valuable community members when provided with appropriate support and recognition. His story also sparked broader conversations about the value of preserving family farms and traditional agricultural practices in an era of corporate agriculture. Harold's dedication to producing quality food for his local community represented values that many people admired but rarely encountered in their increasingly globalized food system. Local restaurants began featuring Harold's produce on their menus, highlighting the connection between community agriculture and local cuisine. These partnerships provided Harold with additional income while giving diners the opportunity to support traditional farming practices and taste the difference that comes from produce grown with care and attention to quality rather than just quantity. The ripple effects of Judge Caprio's decision extended into unexpected areas of community life. Harold's story inspired local schools to establish garden programs where students could learn about agriculture and connect with elderly community members who possess traditional farming knowledge. These intergenerational partnerships created valuable learning opportunities while honoring the wisdom and experience of older citizens. Religious congregations throughout Rhode Island began organizing volunteer programs to assist elderly farmers and other community members facing regulatory or economic challenges. Harold's example of dignity in the face of difficulty became a model for how communities could support their most vulnerable members while respecting their independence and contributions. The story also reached agricultural communities far beyond Rhode Island, inspiring similar support programs in rural areas across the country. Farmers' markets began highlighting elderly vendors, recognizing their contributions to agricultural traditions and community food security. Agricultural fairs created special recognition categories for farmers who had maintained family operations for multiple generations. Harold's case became a case study in law enforcement and judicial training programs, demonstrating how officers and judges could balance enforcement responsibilities with community service and human compassion. The story showed how creative solutions to regulatory challenges could achieve compliance while supporting rather than penalizing citizens facing difficult circumstances. 6 months after his court appearance, Harold was invited to be the Grand Marshal of Rhode Island's annual Harvest Festival, a recognition that brought his story full circle from legal challenge to community celebration. The elderly farmer rode his same weathered tractor in the parade, but this time as a symbol of honored tradition rather than regulatory violation. The documentary that was eventually produced about Harold's story and Judge Caprio's response became an educational tool used in civics classes, judicial training programs, and community organization workshops. It demonstrated how individual cases could become catalysts for positive change when handled with wisdom, compassion, and commitment to community values. Harold's impact on Judge Caprio was equally profound. The judge later described the elderly farmer's case as one of the most meaningful of his career, reinforcing his belief that the law should serve humanity rather than simply enforce technical compliance. Harold's dignity and the community response to his story validated Frank's approach to justice and inspired him to continue looking for opportunities to use judicial authority for positive community impact. The practical assistance program that emerged from Harold's case eventually helped hundreds of elderly farmers throughout New England comply with regulatory requirements while maintaining their operations. The program's success led to its adoption as a model for similar initiatives in other states, extending Harold's impact far beyond his own community. Years later, Harold continued farming his land, supported by a community that had learned to value and protect the traditions and values he represented. His story had transformed from a potential legal problem into a celebration of American character, community support, and the power of compassionate leadership to create positive change. The elderly farmer's simple decision to drive his tractor to court had revealed something beautiful about the potential for human connection and mutual support that exists within every community. Judge Caprio's response had shown how those in positions of authority could use their power to uplift rather than diminish, to celebrate rather than condemn, and to create hope rather than despair. Harold Thompson's legacy was ultimately not just about farming or legal proceedings, but about the enduring power of dignity, community, and compassion to transform challenges into opportunities for growth and connection. His story became a permanent reminder that in every interaction between citizens and institutions lies the potential for recognition, respect, and mutual support that strengthens the fabric of society itself. The 87-year-old farmer, who had driven his tractor to court seeking only to resolve a legal matter, had instead become a symbol of values that transcended individual circumstances. Values of hard work, community contribution, and the kind of quiet heroism that builds and sustains the communities where we all live and thrive. Thanks for watching. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell us in the comments below if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of justice and compassion.